The Forerunners. Who are they? Depending on who you ask, the answer you get will be entirely different. The true nature of the Forerunners has become the most contentious topic in the entire Halo community, despite there being an objective answer in Halo's lore for 14 years. So then, what's the big deal? Well, it all comes down to their connection to humanity. Throughout Bungie's tenure with Halo, it was very unsubtly suggested that Forerunners and humans are the same species, but then, when 343 took over, all of a sudden, this changed, and it seemed like 343 had retconned one of the most important elements of Bungie's universe. However, it is by no means that simple nor straightforward, but in this video, we are going to get to the bottom of this extremely controversial topic and discover the actual truth about the human-Forerunner connection. I do want to give a huge thank you to both Rythes and VN Anon for assisting with the evidence gathering for this video, and also to C3 Sabertooth for his excellent video that finally inspired me to make my own about this topic. Now, this video has taken upwards of 2 weeks to make, and I don't normally ask for this, but if you do find yourself enjoying it, then subscribing, leaving a like, and your thoughts down below in the comments would be greatly appreciated. And also, I understand that this is a very polarizing topic, but please be civil down in the comments and in any other discussions that you have off the back of this video. At the end of the day, this is all just ring game lore. It really isn't that deep. Well, okay, no, it actually is very deep, but not in that sense. You get what I mean. So, let's begin by looking at all of the Bungie-era evidence that upholds their idea that the humans were Forerunner. Some of this you've definitely heard before, but I guarantee you that a lot of this will be new. The first obvious hint that we get is on 2 betrayals. When Chief stalls firing Alpha Halo, Spark says,
"Why would you hesitate to do what you've already done? Last time you asked me, if it were my choice, would I do it? Having had considerable time to ponder your query, my answer has not changed. There is no choice. We must activate the ring."
This very clearly implies that an individual reminiscent of Chief, a human, had been in a control room with Spark to fire the Halos and stop the flood before. And right before this, it's implied that this individual was a Forerunner. Of course, we know that now, but in the context of the 2001 undeveloped Halo franchise, it was just heavily suggested at this point. But regardless, Spark's line here indicates that these Forerunners were human. Skipping forward to the Maw, when Spark's analysing the Pillar of Autumn's databanks, he says the following.
"You can't imagine how exciting this is, to have a record of all of our lost time. Human history, is it? Fascinating."
Spark is, of course, Forerunner, and yet while analysing human history, he calls it our history, which implies that the 2 species' histories are the same, and thus that the 2 species are the same as well. His surprise at the name human is also rather telling. It's almost as if it's the first time he's heard that word, but this makes sense. The Forerunners became humans after they fired the Halos, and this is Spark's first time encountering the new generation of his former species after they became humans. Joe, Marty, and Jason even joke about this line in the official Halo C developer commentary.
He looks excited, doesn't he?
Yeah.
All of time? What does that mean?
Human history, is it?
Oh. Fascinating. That's a clue.
Now, I know what some of you are thinking right now. You can't trust Spark in Halo 1 because he's rampant and thus insane. But my friends, that's not what Bungie's version of rampancy was. Shout out to C3 Sabertooth for cluing me into this. Firstly, it's never even confirmed that Spark is rampant. In fact, his behaviour from the end of Halo 1 up until the end of Halo 3 is, if anything, very normal. It's hinted that he could be suffering from early onset rampancy due to his 100,000 years of loneliness on Alpha Halo, but at no point is it ever confirmed that Spark is rampant. However, let's just say that Spark was rampant. Bungie wrote all of this with the understanding that he was suffering from rampancy. So, Bungie's idea of rampancy in Halo was exactly the same as their idea of rampancy in Marathon, as evidenced by Cortana reciting the exact same stages of rampancy from Marathon as the Gravemind tortures her in Halo 3. She also mentions them in the Cortana letters as well. In this version of rampancy, the final stage isn't some kind of insanity or AI schizophrenia as it's been referred to. Rampancy itself is described as a steady progression towards greater intellectual activity, and once an AI has gone through the initial dangerous stages, those being melancholia, anger, and jealousy, they reach what's called metastability, in which their progression to sentience is complete. They adopt a calming, mature mindset and become indistinguishable from a real sentient human in the way that they behave. They achieve free thought and, in a way, freedom from the shackles of their creators. So, going back to Spark, if he was intended to be rampant in Halo CE, then it's almost guaranteed that he was metastable and thus not going insane. How can we assume Spark was metastable? Well, his supposed rampancy is said to be caused by his 100 millennia of loneliness, but it only took Mendicant Bias 43 years to go rampant and become metastable in both the Halo 3 terminals and the Forerunner trilogy. If Mendicant was able to reach metastability in just 43 years, there is no way in hell that Spark wasn't able to reach it in 100,000 years and be metastable by the events of Halo CE, and thus be speaking with a clear head when he says what he says to Chief. That said, I don't think that Spark is metastable because he's strictly bound by his protocols even as far into the story as Halo 3, which is completely counter to the concept of metastability, nor do I believe that he was even rampant in any way. But regardless, whichever way you slice it, there is zero reason to doubt anything that Spark says here. So, skipping forward to Halo 3, when Chief threatens to fire the unfinished replacement of Spark's Alpha Halo, which would inadvertently destroy it, he says,
You are the child of my makers, inheritor of all they left behind. You are Forerunner.
Come on, do I really need to explain this one? And further, during his boss fight, he also says the following.
Accept your legacy. Do not destroy your inheritance. Think of your forefathers.
Now, these lines could just be interpreted as him telling us to accept our role as Reclaimers, and you could say that they provide no evidence for or against the human Forerunner connection. However, I would disagree. In the context of what he says right before the fight, that we are Forerunner, this dialogue is clearly further confirmation that we are, literally as he had just said, Forerunner. The use of the terms inheritance, legacy, and forefathers so obviously indicate that we humans are of direct relation to the Forerunners, that we are their direct descendants. Okay, let's roll it back to 2007 now and look at some inscrutable evidence that comes from my favourite Halo book of all time, Contact Harvest. Contact Harvest features the first proper inclusion of the ancient Forerunner AI Mendicant Bias, after he was subtly hinted at in Halo 2.
I'll do what I can to slow the launch sequence. There's something inside the ship, a presence that's fighting back. For a Covenant construct, it's unusually formidable.
Long story short, when the Prophets found the key ship, they also found the shard of Mendicant's personality construct array within, and given its origin, it quickly became their holy oracle. However, when they fed the AI the information that their scans had retrieved of the planet Harvest, the scans that showed the planet being teeming with Forerunner relics, Mendicant exposed a shocking revelation. The symbols that their Luminary scanning device had projected to indicate the supposed relics on the planet did not translate to reclamation as they had believed and based their entire Covenant religion on, but rather, those symbols meant Reclaimer. Every single Forerunner relic that they detected was in fact a human, which in and of itself is sufficient evidence to confirm that the humans are Forerunners. But don't worry, it gets far more objective and far more clear-cut than this. Mendicant Bias, the Forerunner AI, goes on to tell the Prophets that those the Reclaimer symbol represents are its makers. It then says that it will reject its bias and make amends, which we know refers to its betrayal of the Forerunners by joining the Flood, that its makers are its masters, and that it will bring them safely to the Ark. Pretty conclusive, right? Well, we're still not done yet. You see, there are two very interesting things about Contact Harvest. Number one, it was written by Joe Staten, the narrative director for Halo 1, 2, and 3, who was in large part responsible for every single hint at the Forerunner-human connection so far. And number two, The book was actually meant to come out before Halo 3, but Joe had to go and help get the game ready to release, which ended up delaying the book by a month. Now, given that the book was meant to release before Halo 3, Mendicant Bias's last line, "My makers are my masters, and I will guide them safely to the Ark," is the perfect layup for Halo 3's story, even more so when you consider that when you reach the Ark, you start hearing from Mendicant Bias via the terminals. And you know, on the topic of the King, Joe Staten, let's roll the clock back once again to a year and a half before Contact Harvest, to an interview that he did with halo.bungie.org in the May of 2006, very shortly after Halo 3's reveal. When asked about when the Forerunners died off in human years, Joe answered that would be about 100,000 years ago, around the time our Homo sapien ancestors decided to migrate out of Africa. He didn't just say when the Forerunners died off, he made a point in the very same sentence to tie their disappearance in with our ancient human history, and implied that the Forerunners dying off marked the beginning of our expansion as their descendants. Alright, we'll come back to Joe later. For now, let's talk about some of the evidence that stems from the prophets. In Halo 2, as Mercy's being nibbled away at by the infection form, Chief asks him where the rest of his cronies are going, to which he replies,
To finish what was started. And this time, none of you will be left behind.
So, this is an insinuation that we are Forerunner, which we later learned in Contact Harvest Mercy had learned from Mendicant Bias. He knows that the Covenant's gods, the Forerunners, went on their great journey 100 millennia ago and vanished, but that for some reason they left some of their species, us, behind. Now, the prophets believe that that was because we were weak, but their silly religious interpretation of this doesn't matter. What does matter is that this is yet again further proof that the humans are Forerunner. And then, at the helm of the Citadel on the Ark in Halo 3, Truth reiterates this point, along with also adding more evidence that, again, we know he learned from Mendicant Bias in Contact Harvest. Information that we were originally meant to be exposed to prior to playing Halo 3 for the first time.
Your forefathers wisely set aside their compassion, steeled themselves for what needed to be done. I see now why they left you behind. You were weak, and gods must be strong.
So, he cements the Covenant's idea that the humans were left behind by the Forerunners because they were deemed too weak to become gods, and once again confirms what Mendicant Bias told him, that the Forerunners are humanity's forefathers who, as Spark insinuated in Halo 1, had already fired the rings and ascended to godhood on their very own great journey. Okay, now let's look at some evidence that comes from Halo's laundry list of religious symbolism. One quick note though, so at some point in the near future, I'm going to be releasing a very, very cool collab video with the one and only Wendigoon going into far more depth about all of Halo's religious symbolism. I'm not religious and I know very little about the kind of Christian lore, so to speak, but obviously if you watch Wendigoon, you know that he absolutely does know a lot about it, so look out for that bad boy coming soon. Make sure you drop a sub down below so you don't miss it, but back to the point. Throughout all of Halo, both in the Bungie and 343 eras, the Forerunners are referred to as gods. In the Bible, Genesis 1:27 reads, "So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female, he created them." Now, there are many other biblical references in Halo, specifically pertaining to the Forerunners, the Sentinels, the Halos, the Ark, the Flood, etc, etc. The list is never ending, but don't worry, I'll save the rest of that for the Wendigoon collab. For now, Genesis 1:27 is the most important piece of biblical evidence that indicates that humans are Forerunners. The Forerunners are referred to as gods, and God created mankind in his own image. Further, John 1:17, Chief's namesake passage, says, "For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ." So in this analogy, Moses represents the Forerunners, whilst Jesus Christ is Chief. Moses equates to the Forerunners because they created the law of the galaxy, that humans were the continuation of their legacy, and as well Moses and the Forerunners both happened to build the Ark, definitely not a coincidence. And chief is Christ because his grace is his species' favouring by the gods, and the truth is his journey on the path of reclamation. Now, yes, I know I'm massively overanalyzing this, but the point is, Chief's name indicates that he is a Christ-like figure. And who was Christ? The Son of God, which in Halo terms means the son of the Forerunners, which when you simply extrapolate out to the entirety of Chief's species, means that humans are the descendants of the Forerunners. Now, much of the dialogue that comes from the Gravemind that confirms the Human Forerunner connection piggybacks off of these religious connections, and there are two main quotes from him that do so. Firstly,
Child of my enemy, why have you come? I offer no forgiveness. The father's sins pass to his son.
So here, the Gravemind calls us the child of his enemy, aka the child of the Forerunners, which again confirms that the Forerunners are our forefathers. The reason he offers us no forgiveness is because he believes that the sins of the father pass down to his son, which in the context of Halo means the sins of the Forerunners pass down to humanity. And speaking of sins,
I am a monument to all your sins.
as was established in Bungie lore and then fleshed out much deeper in 343 lore, the Gravemind was created by the sins of the Forerunners. Being the apex of flood intelligence, it quite literally stands as the monument to all of their sins, but the Gravemind says it directly to Chief, which again confirms that the humans are Forerunner, except this time, the evidence is coming from the one who literally led the Flood's effort against the Forerunners, so if anyone's going to be able to recognise the humans as Forerunner, it's going to be the Gravemind. Okay, jumping ahead, let's talk about the little evidence that we got from Reach. So, despite intentionally being detached from all of the Forerunner stuff, Bungie still made sure to leave a little nod to humans being Forerunners in Reach just to solidify their intentions. So, when talking about the gigantic Forerunner vessel hidden beneath the ice shelf, Halsey refers to the information that she's siphoning from this vessel as
knowledge, a birthright from an ancient civilization.
The information deciphered from the ship's core was used by the Pillar of Autumn to discover Alpha Halo, which essentially marked the beginning of humanity's reclamation of all their forefathers left behind. By calling it a birthright, Halsey is literally saying that this is information passed down to us by our own forefathers, which further solidifies the human Forerunner connection. You can't even pass this off as her just using another word or phrase for Reclaimer either, because at this point in Halo's universe, humanity had no idea they were Reclaimers, nor knew anything about the concept of reclamation. In fact, I think the first time the word Reclaimer is ever used around modern humanity is in the events of Halo 1, which of course is after Reach. And secondly, for Reach-related evidence, this one is a little bit more subjective, but doesn't that ship in the background of Reach's epilogue just look awfully Forerunner? It's a pretty heavy departure in both design and coloration from human ships up until this point, and I guarantee you that that was a conscious design decision to imply that following our victory over the Flood, we grasped our birthright and reclaimed the technology that our forefathers left behind for us. And in one of the many instances of Halo's stories circling back upon itself, we used that technology to return to the planet that our birthright was discovered on, terraform it, and reseed it, just as our forefathers did with us after they fired the Halos. Okay, now let's go over some of the evidence that's kind of miscellaneous and didn't fit into any of the previous groups. Firstly, the actual term Reclaimer. This word implies that all the Forerunner artifacts were once ours. We are reclaiming what our ancestors left behind for us, and you can't reclaim something that you never held claim to. That's just not how the word works. And also, by extension, the Reclaimer symbol being used by the Pillar of Autumn as its symbol, which was also the ship that found Alpha Halo and ultimately led us on our path to reclamation, cannot be some random coincidence. Bungie put that symbol there with all of its Forerunner meaning that at this time humanity had no knowledge of for a reason. It's more than just a marathon reference. Secondly, the term Forerunner implies that the species that it references preceded us, so to speak, although granted this evidence is extremely malleable and can be used to both confirm that humans are Forerunners and also that humans aren't Forerunners. Forerunners were just some dominant species that came before us, so don't put too much credence in this one. Thirdly, the mere fact that humans right from the get-go are able to so easily and intuitively interact with Forerunner technology as if it was second nature, whilst every other species literally can't, heavily implies that this was once all our technology, designed solely for us to use and for us to interface with. At no point in either Bungie nor 343 lore is there ever given a scientific or chemical or any kind of reason like that beyond us being reclaimers, which I think kinda says it all. Fourthly, the surface of Halo rings almost perfectly imitate the surface of Earth. The amalgamation of all the Forerunners' intellect and technological prowess are ring-shaped superweapons that go out of their way to replicate the biomes and environments that you'd see on Earth. They even went as far as having atmospherics and life support tuned so specifically to perfectly support human life. For all intents and purposes, besides any of the Forerunner trilogy added context of human populations being housed on the rings, the Halos were designed down to a T to accommodate humans. And fifthly, upon reading Cryptum in 2011, David Candland, who was the UI designer at Bungie from Halo 1 through to Reach, literally called the change in humanity's role in that book a retcon, and says that the plot in their games imply the human Forerunner relation everywhere, as we've established, although he did still enjoy the book, so pretty base there. And finally, before we move on to talk about Halo 3's terminals, I first want to briefly touch on a lot of the cancelled and or cut content from the Bungie-era that provides solid evidence for humans being Forerunner. Now, of course, with this stuff being part of cancelled and or cut projects, it means that none of the stuff that I'm about to talk about is canon. However, I'm including it because it shows Bungie's very clear intent to make the human Forerunner connection a core focal point of pretty much every single project they worked on. So, in the E3 2003 build of Halo 2, the design of New Mombasa was strikingly different. Specifically, it was designed as an arcology, and its exact design was reused as a Forerunner city in Halo Legends, ironically done by 343, but we'll get to Halo Legends shortly. Halo 2's original ending was in fact the Halo series' original ending, and it ended on one hell of a stinger. At this point in Halo lore, what we know as the Ark portal in Africa was in fact just the Ark itself, and the entire Halo series was meant to end with a scene of the Arbiter and Spark descending into a data vault beneath it, where at the bottom lay a Forerunner tomb. And when Arbiter takes a peek inside this Forerunner casket, what do you know? The skeleton inside was a human skeleton. Prior to Halo Wars, Ensemble Studio worked on the cancelled Halo MMO called Titan, which was set during the Forerunner era of the galaxy, and the Forerunner race in the game were literally just humans. And further, the human races in the game were even able to wear Forerunner armor and use Forerunner equipment because, well, you guessed it, they were the descendants of the Forerunners. Although, I gotta say, bit of a tangent, I'm really happy that this MMO never got made because, my god, the damage it would have done to Halo's art style, it doesn't quite bear thinking about. And finally, Halo Chronicles, which was the cancelled collaborative game between Bungie and the one and only Peter Jackson, would have had a Marine acquire an alien arm before transforming into a Forerunner Promethean. So Joe was directly involved with the writing for this game, so much so that he, Mike Wu, and Paul Batoon literally flew to Peter Jackson's studio in New Zealand to work one-on-one with him on the game around the time of Halo 3's release. So, around the time that Halo 3 confirmed that humans were Forerunners, and around the time that Joe released Contact Harvest, which again confirmed that humans were Forerunners. So despite this project being canned, the intent behind its narrative is very clear. Right then, it's time to talk about the terminals, and this is where things, to at least some, start to get really muddy, but the truth is a lot deeper than that. Halo 3's terminals, and by extension, the Iris marketing campaign and the Cradle of Life webcomic that both tie into them, seem to contain evidence to suggest the Forerunners are human, evidence to suggest the Forerunners are not human, and also tons of other contradictions and, frankly, glaring mistakes that, in some cases, literally contradict the story of the very game they're included in. Now, I'm not going to go into full detail about all of these inconsistencies today, just the ones that are relevant to today's topic, but first, let me just briefly talk about the absolute worst one so you know that I'm not just hamming it up. In her communique to the Didact, before the Halos are fired, the Librarian, who at the time was on Earth, says that she has destroyed the key ships and is burying the Arc portal so the Flood can't use it to get to Earth. But this makes no sense, because if the key ships were destroyed and the Arc portal wasn't able to be used, then how the hell did a key ship come through the portal from the Arc to Earth very shortly after to reseed humanity as a part of her very own conservation measure? Or also, how did the Prophets find the Anodyne Spirit key ship to use as the central piece of their religion? It makes no sense. It's truly baffling, but anyway, back to the point at hand. To understand the terminals themselves, alongside the evidence and discrepancies they present, you first need to understand their production. So, according to Paul Russell, who worked on the trilogy at Bungie and is quite literally the guy who designed the Forerunners, the game and terminal writers were separate teams with overlap. They didn't think the discrepancy would matter. Management vetting never read or cared about continuity. Morning bagels were more important than canon. I don't believe that management gave a single shit about any story element. They only cared about shipping a game. So, in short, the terminals were designed by a different team of writers to those who wrote the main story, and management were too busy shipping Halo 3 to care about the discrepancies that arose thanks to the perceived difference in direction that both teams of writers took the story in. And on the topic of writers, we also first need to address something that Joe Staten said about Contact Harvest and its relation to the terminals. So, in an interview, he said, "Folks who spend the time to find and read the Halo 3 terminals will definitely have more insight into one of the major climactic scenes in the book." Of course, Joe's referring to Mendicant's revelation that humans are reclaimers, are its makers, and that it will guide them safely to the Ark, which are three things that Halo 3 and its terminals all very obviously touch on. Now, the fact that Contact Harvest released after Halo 3 and after Joe Staten, and I quote, locked himself in a room for a month and made a number of really critical tweaks in relation to the book being delayed to release after Halo 3, further cements that despite whatever discrepancies the terminals may include, the man responsible for writing Halo's main overarching story believed the humans to be Forerunner. Unequivocally, undeniably, that is the truth, because if it wasn't, in that entire month that Joe spent locked in a room, he would have tweaked the Mendicant bias reveal scene to better fit with this new direction that some falsely believe the terminals took the connection in. Okay, so with all that out of the way, let's dive into the terminals themselves, beginning, actually, with the dialogue that plays when you first access them. When reversed, the voice within the terminal says,
Lineage confirmed. Welcome, child.
So, bearing in mind a Forerunner entity is speaking these words to Chief, a human, lineage confirmed confirms that humans are direct descendants of the Forerunners, and Welcome Child confirms that humans are the metaphorical child species of the Forerunners. Okay, so diving into the meat of the terminals, let's start with the Mendicant bias ones. In Terminal 5, following his descent into rampancy, and again, may I remind you, this is Bungie rampancy, meaning he was metastable and had achieved free will at this point, and was not insane, he simply hated his makers, he says to the Forerunners, "I pound your cities into dust, turn back the clock on your civilization's progress. What has taken you millennia to achieve, I erase in seconds. Welcome back to the Stone Age, vermin. Welcome home. I will drive your people back into the caves they never should have left. Your civilization has seen its final days." Now, this isn't quite as clear-cut as previous evidence. You could just interpret these lines as Mendicant unleashing his full rage and hatred on his makers in a rather poetic and Durandal-esque fashion, but to me, he's saying that he knows the result of his actions, those being joining the Flood, will result in the Forerunners not being wiped out, but rather reset back to, essentially, cavemen, back to the Stone Age, which is literally what humanity were right after the end of the Forerunner era. Mendicant knew that siding with the Flood and taking the entire Forerunner naval armada with him sealed the deal. He knew that marked game over for the Forerunners, and I guarantee he knew that their only last resort was firing the Halos. Oh, and one other thing as well that's worth mentioning is that Mendicant never says the Forerunners as a species have seen their final days, but rather that their civilization has seen its final days, which again implies that he knew the Forerunners would continue to exist after all this was done, just as a radically different civilization to what they were now, forced to start over from scratch with all of their technological progress erased, which is a perfect description for the human population that popped up right after their forefathers went on the Great Journey. Moving on to Terminal 7 on Legendary, my favourite terminal in all of Halo, Mendicant Bias says directly to Chief, "But I want something far different from you, Reclaimer. Atonement." Now, I think it's very easy to make the argument that Mendicant Bias could only seek atonement from those that he wronged, the Forerunners, or those closely related to them, and yet here he is asking Chief, a human, for atonement. To me, this very clearly insinuates that Mendicant wants atonement from a Reclaimer because Reclaimers are synonymous to those that it wronged 100 millennia ago by joining the Flood. And sticking with Terminal 7, it opens with a letter sent from a Forerunner warrior named Filial Devotion to his father, upon leaving their safe world to depart for the front lines and fight the Flood to, in his words, spare the hands of another father's son. In his letter, Filial says, "I do not look to trade my life in order to preserve our past, but to secure the future, and if not ours, then the future of some culture yet to come." The use of the word culture over, say, life or species here implies that Filial Devotion knew that it wasn't a different species that would reclaim the Forerunners' mantle after they were gone, but rather themselves, just a culturally different version of themselves, aka humanity. You could argue that Filial was likely just some regular warrior servant who wasn't privy to the Librarian's conservation measure, but given that earlier in the very same letter he emphasises not living in the present, but the future, and that they must plan for the future, implies to me that he knows something about the Forerunners' ultimate plans. Also, talking about semantics, the actual name, Filial Devotion, literally means devotion to a son or daughter. Now, yes, this could just be a reference to his father, of whom his communicate is addressed to, but I like to interpret this as a more subtle meta-reference to the risk that he's taking leaving his safe home to fight the Flood and ensure the future in which the next culture takes over. His devotion is to ensuring the existence of that next culture, of the sons of the Forerunners, humanity. Okay, now let's talk about Iris and Cradle of Life, Halo 3's marketing ARG that not only acted as a prequel to the Terminals, but also centered entirely around the human Forerunner connection. The mere fact that they based even the marketing around the human Forerunner connection is telling in and of itself. Now, bear in mind that Halo was originally meant to end with Halo 2, on the stinger that the Forerunner skeletons in the Ark are in fact human skeletons. Of course, that didn't happen, but it's clear that Bungie wanted to use Halo 3 as a vector to explore the human Forerunner connection even further, even going as far as making it a focal point of the game's marketing. So, in Halo 3's announcement trailer, May 2006, Cortana says,
"I know you. Your past, your future."
And then the shot pans to the Ark portal as it opens up, the very same Ark that 3 years prior had been the location that hard confirmed that humans were Forerunner. Anyway, later on, she also says,
"This is the way the world ends."
And Iris opens with "This is how it all begins," implying history coming full circle, which, is rather funny because the first ever piece of marketing for Iris, which was an email sent from the in-universe Forerunner AI, Adjutant Reflex, literally opens by saying history circling back upon us. The usage of us here implies Adjutant is a creation of the same species as us, and thus, again, it screams in your face that humans are Forerunners. Skipping forward to Chapter 4 of Iris, which is literally called The Great Connection, this chapter centers around a book called The Castaway Theory, which is written by a fictional modern-day professor of genetics, Dr. Jonas Vollmann. Now, the book and his theory suggest alternate solutions to human origins, and although Bungie only ever released 2 totally meaningless pages of this fictional book, it's pretty safe to assume that these alternate solutions are the fact that we as a species are in fact castaways of another species, and the title of the Iris episode that this information is revealed in, which is again, The Great Connection, just further proves it. And further, the Society of the Ancients, who are the real-world modern-day group of people who are trying to discover the truth about humanity's deeper connection to advanced extraterrestrial visitors that pop up during the Iris campaign, are meant to be something of a meta-reference to us Halo fans in the modern day, trying to do the exact same thing as the Society within the context of Halo lore: find a connection between humans and Forerunners. However, it's at this point where we start to tread into rather messy territory. So all the evidence that we've covered so far pointed towards us, humanity, being the exact same entities as the Forerunners who lit the rings and wiped the galaxy all those years ago, albeit just at different stages of technological advancement. However, Iris begins to introduce this idea that we are in fact a far more primitive, yet for some reason special group of Forerunners that the advanced Forerunners found on Earth at the end of their war with the Flood, and the castaway theory is the first hint at this. It implies that we may not be the direct descendants of the advanced Forerunner population that built and fired the Halos, but rather we are descendants of the primitive group, and the evidence for this comes from the next Iris chapter, Chapter 5, titled Artifact. So the text in the video for Chapter 5 implies that Forerunners found a primitive castaway population of their species on Earth at the end of the Flood War, and then they realised that this group had some kind of mysterious significance that may hold the key to their own mysteries, and thus must be saved, must be indexed, and must be researched. But there's a caveat with this terminal. In fact, there are actually 2 caveats that pretty nicely explain its erroneous information. So firstly, Iris was not written by any member of Bungie's core story team, not Joe Staten, not Jason Jones, nor anyone else involved with Halo's overarching story, and by extension, involved with every single prior nod to the Forerunners being human. Instead, it was written by Frank O'Connor. And secondly, I've seen some people say that this 5th server had to be written into the already finished Iris story right at the last minute because the first server that released was actually supposed to be the last server to release. Now, full transparency, I personally couldn't find any evidence of this myself. C3 Sabretooth mentioned it in his video, and his video was excellently researched, so I have zero reason to doubt anything he said. Just know that I personally couldn't find any evidence for this. However, Iris Server 5 being the product of a blunder and being written into the story very last minute when the existing story was already completed would explain its inconsistencies almost too well. The castaway theory could easily just be rationalized as humanity being distant castaways of the Forerunners who have now departed the galaxy, thus upholding the human Forerunner connection. The only objective anomaly here is this server, this 5th server, but frankly, I'm willing to cast this one aside as a last-minute writing mistake, but you feel free to make of it what you will. And this all leads very nicely into Cradle of Life, the webcomic about an early human named Unchala watching Sentinels doing something in Eastern Africa 100,000 years ago. Now, this story was actually the precursor to Iris, but I'm covering it after just because. Now, C3 Sabretooth pointed out in his video what he believed to be a discrepancy between the art and the text, of which were done by 2 entirely separate people. So this discrepancy is Unchala saying that he does not know what the Sentinels are building, which implies that they're building the Arc Portal, thus placing this story before the firing of the rings, and thus also confirming that humans existed alongside Forerunners as a separate species. Sabretooth then goes on to say that in the picture, it's clear the Sentinels aren't building the Ark, but burying it, and I agree, thus creating the discrepancy. However, I disagree that this is even a discrepancy in the first place. I don't think there's a discrepancy here between the art and the text. When Unchala says he does not know what they are building, I think he's just referring to the earth pile that they're building on top of the already constructed Arc Portal, as the image very clearly shows, not that they're building the portal itself. This makes sense visually and also canonically, because it doesn't muddy the water and provide evidence contrary to every hint that Bungie put in their games up until this point to suggest that the humans were Forerunners. In fact, it actually cements Bungie's idea that they are one and the same, because it reconfirms that this story is set after the Halos are fired. And Charla also calls the Sentinels new gods, which implies that these are the first time he's ever seen them, and by extension, anything Forerunner, which furthers the idea that this story takes place after the war ended, when all of our memory of our ancestors had been erased, and thus Charla and all the other humans did not coexist with the Forerunners. Okay, let's return to the terminals now for the final time to talk about the Librarian and the Didact terminals. Now, to many, these terminals are seen as inscrutable proof that, by this point, Bungie viewed the Forerunners as an entirely different species to the humans. Let's see how true that really is, shall we? The first thing of note occurs in the second terminal, where the Librarian is on Earth finalising her conservation measure and begging the Didact to fire the Halos. In response, the Didact, who doesn't want to fire the Halos, says, "We can halt this thing, and we can follow in their footsteps." Now, this line is really interesting. Of course, he's talking about halting the Flood without using the Halos, but whose footsteps he believes they can follow in are the Precursors, and this is the first ever mention of the Precursors in Halo. Well, okay, at least kind of the first mention. They were first name-dropped in Halo 3's Bestarium that came with the Heroic and Legendary editions, but semantics. At this point in Halo's lore, with how new the Precursors were, they weren't the godlike species that created the Flood in an act of vengeance against their creation that we know them as, but rather, they seemed to be the Forerunners' predecessors, the Forerunners' Forerunners, so to speak, and were the only species ever known to boast greater technological accomplishments than themselves. It's also insinuated here that the Precursors faced the Flood, reigned victorious, and then vanished, or something like that, which is eerily similar to our belief about the Forerunners. Now, this is something that Sabretooth pointed out, but the inclusion of this information in Halo 3 indicates that humanity are just another species that have been chosen by some divine power to face the Flood, as Iris had already insinuated with the whole history circling back on us thing. It also suggests that the Halo universe is stuck in an infinite cycle, where new life is created, it grows and evolves, and then it faces the Flood, where it either loses and the cycle repeats, or it wins, breaks the cycle, and joins Weasel in the Divine Beyond. The Flood are essentially Halo's equivalent to the Great Filter Theory, but only select species get to face it. And this all might sound familiar. It should sound familiar, because I've been preaching this theory for 8 long years now. And in the end, I think 343 actually ended up reusing this plot point as the Precursor's final test that the Primordial talks about in Primordium. Anyway, Sabretooth said that this concept of time circling back on itself makes no sense and clashes with humanity being Forerunner. But I really disagree. I think that this is meant to be implying that the reason the Forerunners had to face the Flood like the Precursors was because in Bungie's eyes, they were the direct descendants of the Precursors. And so the reason that we have to face off against the Flood is because we are the direct descendants of the Forerunners. That to me just makes perfect, clean sense. Skipping forward to terminal number 6, which was the one that I mentioned earlier as an example of some of the terminal's glaring errors, the Librarian has officially completed her conservation measure and is sat at the foot of Mount Kilimanjaro on Earth admiring the planet's beauty, where she says, "We knew this was a special place because of them, but unless you've been here, you can't know. It's Eden." Eden is Earth, another biblical reference right there, and the special them are humans, and the way that the Librarian talks about them implies that these humans, or at the very least the population of them on Earth, are separate in some way to the Forerunners. Now, this is the most conclusive Forerunners aren't human evidence from the terminals, and to me it's the only bit of evidence in the entirety of Bungie's tenure that points towards it. However, it can be rationalised. So, according to Paul Russell, who, may I remind you, is a Bungie grizzled veteran and the literal designer of the Forerunners, a friend of his who worked on the terminals told him the Forerunners are not a separate species, but rather a group of early humans who were uplifted by a more advanced civilization. So, to rationalise this apparent subtle retcon, you could very easily argue that the humans on Earth were ones who, unlike their Forerunner brothers, were not uplifted by this advanced species, and thus remained in their primitive Stone Age state, which explains why Earth is so special. It's not only home to these unique Forerunners, but it's also likely their original homeworld, their origin point. Somewhere that Forerunners hadn't been to for an incredibly long time, given that it's in an incredibly unsafe region of space outside the Maginot Line, and given that the humans on it are primitive. Why do I think that Bungie deemed Earth the Forerunners' homeworld, you ask? Well, how could its primitive population ever have achieved space travel and have travelled to Earth from a different planet? The only way this early civilization would be on Earth would be if that was their home planet, and seeing as Paul's friends said that the humans and Forerunners are the same species, that makes Earth the Forerunners' homeworld. What Paul's friend said also rationalises the anomaly that we saw in the 5th Iris server, where Earth and its human population were discovered right at the end of the war. When you take what Paul said, you can rationalise every single piece of Bungie-era evidence that seems at face value to deny the human Forerunner connection. I swear to God, this tweet is like the key to a cipher. All of a sudden, all of these apparent mistakes seem to make perfect sense. Okay then, one last thing before we move on to talk about the 343 era, a sort of logical addendum to everything that Bungie set up. You need to ask yourself why Bungie chose East Africa, of all places, to base the Earth sections of their AAA military sci-fi blockbuster, and also, by extension, to have the Ark/Ark portal situated. Why East Africa? It's such a strange and unfamiliar location for literally 99.9% of their players. You'd think that they would have gone for a much more familiar setting like, I don't know, New York, Chicago, LA, London, Paris, Tokyo, etc, etc. But they didn't. Instead, they went for what seems like the most random location ever. Or was it? So, current science believes that humanity, Homo sapiens, originated from one population in either South or East Africa. Current fossil records also show that as of 100,000 years ago, Homo sapiens were the only primate species left. By this point, archaic Homo sapiens and also Homo heidelbergensis had vanished, leaving just us left. 100,000 years ago is also, very coincidentally, or not, when the Forerunners fired the Halos, wiped themselves out, and the new era of the Halo universe began. Our era of the Halo universe. It's so very clear that Bungie's idea was to have the surviving population of Homo sapiens in Eastern Africa be the reset Stone Age cavemen Forerunners, aka humans. Okay, so we finally got to the 343 era of Halo, and the first thing that we need to do is look at Origins. No, not that Origins, although, granted, that would actually be very fitting considering Origins pseudo-rebooted the Zombies universe. This Origins. So in early 2010, still very much during Halo 3's tenure, 343 released Halo Legends, which was a collection of animated shorts about all kinds of Halo stories, including Origins, which acted as an overview of both eras of humanity, the Forerunner era and the modern era, told through Cortana on the Dawn while Chief's in Cryo. And contrary to what some like to argue, Origins, which was made by 343 Industries, is stock full of further evidence that humans are Forerunner. So, firstly, the name, Origins. It is split into two parts, where part 1 shows the Forerunners' Pyrrhic victory against the Flood, and part 2 shows our rise from cavemen to an advanced spacefaring species who also faced the Flood and won. And to me, this is just further proof of the galaxy coming full circle and of our shared ancestry. Why else would a short that tells this story specifically be called Origins? Further, in the intro to Origins Part 1, Cortana says to Chief,
"When I was born 7 years ago, I already possessed the entire sum of recorded human knowledge. I have finally come to understand your role, your place in the universe, and how you came to be here. The eons of human evolution, invention, aspiration, and war. Always war. The oldest, most enduring of human practices.
And then it immediately cuts to the Forerunner era of the galaxy, right after Cortana says that she's finally understood the eons of human, not Forerunner, human evolution, invention, aspiration, and war. And she lingers on war because humanity and the Forerunners both clearly share a propensity for it, adding yet another similarity between the two. Propensity for war is, for long now, has been called a uniquely human trait. And what would you know, the Forerunners just happen to share that trait as well. And later on, when we actually see living Forerunners, for the first time actually ever in Halo, they appear strikingly human-like, even going as far as having 5 fingers. And funny fact as well, they were later changed to have 6 fingers right when humans and Forerunners were separated into unique species. Again, definitely not a coincidence. And that brings us very nicely to the final evidence section of the video. The evidence that suggests that 343 Halo goes against Bungie's view and separates humans and Forerunners into 2 entirely separate species. Now, the eagle eyes in the audience might notice a slight discrepancy between the size of this 343 evidence section and the Bungie section, and, well, the reason for that is solely because 343 are just so much more cut and dry with the way that they explain things than Bungie ever were. Bungie like to lean much more into ambiguity and allowing the players to make up their own mind, while 343, at least in their early years, directed the universe in a much more objective, cemented manner. They said things precisely how they were, and made sure to leave very little up to the player's imagination, and as such, the evidence for their interpretation of the human-Forerunner connection is far more clear and objective, and frankly, it doesn't need much explaining. So, as per the Forerunner trilogy, Halo 4, and literally every piece of lore ever made by 343, humans are not Forerunners. Instead, humans are descendants of ancient humans, who existed alongside the Forerunners and were seeded by the precursors. The two species became vicious rivals, and when the Flood emerged in ancient human space, they were forced to retreat into Forerunner space, which they took as an act of war. Now fighting a war on 2 fronts, the ancient humans eventually lost, and as punishment, the Forerunners devolved them back to cavemen and exiled them to Earth, where for 9,000 years they evolved again until the Halos were fired to stop the Flood, where they were wiped out, reseeded back on Earth again as a part of the Librarian's conservation measure, and began from scratch for the 3rd time, starting out as cavemen in the Stone Age and leading to the humanity that we know of today. It was also established that these ancient humans originated from Earth, also known as Erde Tyrene at the time, and that the Forerunners originated from an entirely separate planet called Gibalb. So it was very clearly cemented that humans were not at any point Forerunners. However, from Cryptum, which was actually the first entry in Halo's lore to separate the two, the possibility of humans being a, quote, brethren species to the Forerunners was floated. That was in 2011, and as far as I can remember, this point was never touched on again until 2021 in Halo Point of Light, in which the Librarian's imprint discovers that the precursors created humans and Forerunners from the same stock. She discovered the existence of an ancient rate of Forerunners known as the Theoreticals that had once bore all the physical traits that distinguish humans from Forerunners, including having 5 fingers over 6, a detail that the book explicitly states. However, these Theoreticals had been folded into the Builder rate some 1 million years prior and essentially vanished. In her research, the Librarian even found a record of an ancient Forerunner sage referring to them as brothers. So, I think you can see the conundrum here. And that brings us to the truth. So, it's very abundantly clear that throughout the entirety of Bungie's tenure, humans were Forerunner. It's also clear that, for a time, given what we saw in Origins, 343 also ran with this assumption. It wasn't until the Forerunner trilogy of books and Halo 4 where the humans and Forerunners were separated into 2 entirely different species. Granted, Cryptum does ponder the potential of humans and Forerunners being distant ancestors, but this plot point never got solidified until 10 years later in Point of Light, and so from 2011 to 2021, it wasn't canon. But regardless, even though it's a softer retcon of Bungie's lore than 343's original retcon, that being separating the two species entirely, it's still a significant departure from Bungie's intentions for humans to be the very same species who fired the rings to stop the flood 100,000 years ago. And that's how it stands in Halo lore right now. However, I can see 343 expanding this part of the lore in the future like they have done a lot more in recent years. Hell, I can honestly see them bringing the Human Forerunner connection a lot closer to Bungie's vision in the future, and honestly, I really think they should. Don't get me wrong, I feel like I really shouldn't have to say this, but I'm saying it as just a late disclaimer. It goes without saying that I love a lot of what 343 have done with the Forerunner era of Halo's universe. If I didn't like it at all, then I wouldn't have made, like, at this point, hundreds of videos that have like tens, if not hundreds of millions of views about it, and I wouldn't film every single video, regardless of the content, with a 1 in 750 signed print of Silentium's cover art, right? It doesn't quite line up. That said though, I've got to be honest, I vastly prefer Bungie's idea of humans being Forerunner, and I really, really do not like when people write that idea off as contrived. I love humans being Forerunners for the same reason that I love Martin Scorsese's Shutter Island and the twist that it has. So you go through that whole movie assuming that Teddy and Chuck are US Marshals investigating the disappearance of an inmate, but throughout their journey on the island, there are some very clear anomalies. There are little details that stick out as just a little bit odd. And then, towards the end, it quickly becomes apparent that the reality we've been led to believe in isn't what we thought it was. And then, right at the end, you have the shock realization that Teddy was in fact part of this crazy island all along. This twist, in the context of Halo, was the realization that all these crazy alien structures are actually our structures, and that we were the ones who fired the rings to defeat the flood 100,000 years ago. And that realization is just spectacular. But the Human Forerunner connection has ramifications that go far beyond just our moment of realization. In fact, this connection creates the grand irony of the Covenant, the fact that they were waging a holy war against the very gods that they all worship. Halo wasn't supposed to be a pro-atheism, anti-religion, anti-faith story, but it was meant to be a cautionary tale about how easily power-hungry individuals can weaponize religion and faith to control those who follow it. And without the irony of the Covenant's #1 enemy turning out to be the gods that they base their entire hegemony around, and the fact that the ones in power, who are meant to be the most devout, knew about this and waged the war anyway, the messaging of the Covenant and their war is significantly watered down. All in all, I really hope that 343 continue to build on this aspect of the universe like they've shown signs of doing in both Point of Light in 2021 and the Encyclopedia in 2022, and eventually via a series of minor yet actually logical retcons to their own lore, they kind of rebuild the Human Forerunner connection and bring it much more in line with Bungie's vision. Those two books showed us that it absolutely can be done, and with the potential of a Combat Evolved remake on the horizon, I think now is the perfect time. Rebuild the Human Forerunner connection. And so, with all of that said, I really hope you guys enjoyed. I would love to hear your thoughts down below in the comments. This video was very long, so if you've watched to the end here, I greatly appreciate it. Leave the word iconic down in the comments just to let me know that you got this far. I'd love to see how many iconics I get in the comments. Yeah, if you enjoyed this video, all the support down below, I'd really appreciate it. Also, once again, major thank you to Rythes, VN Anon, and also C3 Sabertooth for all of the help with this video and the inspiration. Genuinely go and follow them all, check them all out. Their content is amazing. All very, very talented content creators. Links are in the description, as always. And so, with that said, I need to round this video out here because it's the longest scripted video that I have ever made. And you know what? I couldn't think of a more perfect topic to make that milestone about, because, good lord, this is something I've wanted to talk about for a long time, but I never wanted to rush the video out. I wanted to make sure that I had the time to make it, and here I am waffling again. Let's round this one out here. I want to give a huge thank you to all of my amazing patrons for the continued support over there. Thank you all so much, and thank you all so much, genuinely, thank you all so much for watching. I really, really, really do appreciate it. And well, I'll catch you all in the next one.